Happy Friday. Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. I'm joined by Aaron Bastani. Aaron, how are you feeling?
I've got that Funky Friday feeling, Michael. What can I say?
That Funky Friday feeling. I love it. We've got some funky stories for you tonight. Joe Biden's getting a little bit confused. Lots more pressure for him to stand down. How much longer can he last as the Democratic candidate for president? I hope not much longer, because I don't want to see Trump in power for another 4 years. We're talking about prisons again. Labour have made their decision about what to do with overflowing prisons. Shabana Mahmood was talking in very apocalyptic terms. And we're also going to discuss how the Lib Dems sort of constructed a whole election strategy by focusing on posh bakeries. Ever since his disastrous debate performance 2 weeks ago, there has been intense pressure for Joe Biden to step aside ahead of November's presidential race. After 2 gaffes he made yesterday, that pressure is now even stronger. This is how President Biden introduced the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
And now I want to hand it over to the President of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. You can beat President Putin.
The face, there's lots of shots of that clip. Obviously, millions and millions of people have seen it on Twitter. I chose that one because you can see Zelensky's face the whole way through. And just the look on his face when he says President Putin's like, what the, oh my God. Completely disastrous. You can't imagine a worse gaffe to make than confusing Zelensky for the guy who invaded his country. This sort of habit of confusing your enemies with your friends kept happening yesterday. So that happened. The Zelensky-Putin gaffe was sort of after the NATO meeting. Later in the evening, he had a much hyped press conference, and this happened.
What concerns do you have about Vice President Harris's ability to beat Donald Trump if she were at the top of the ticket?
Look, I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, but I think she was not qualified to be president. So let's start there. Number one.
So, if you weren't online last night, there was a really bizarre sort of atmosphere. Can you talk about an atmosphere on sort of Twitter and social media? I'm not sure. But sort of if you're on the New York Times live feed or Twitter or anything, you've got all of these political journalists who are saying, this is such an important make or break moment for Joe Biden, not because sort of they were waiting for an announcement. Normally when you've got everyone sort of waiting for a news conference, it's because you think there's going to be some big announcement. This was purely because people wanted to see if Joe Biden would be able to string a sentence together, because obviously all of the pressure is, is he cognitively fit to run for president? And then immediately he calls President Zelensky President Putin, and then he calls Kamala Harris Vice President Trump. Now, to me, it couldn't really have been more embarrassing. 2 slip-ups, of course, very embarrassing in any context. The problem here as well, as I was saying, these appearances were meant precisely to reassure the American public that Biden was up to the job. And Biden's team, this is the really weird bit, had been hyping up the conference, that press conference you just saw, using a curious turn of phrase.
Big boy press conference. Big boy press conference. A big boy press conference. Hold a press conference. A big boy press conference.
Press conference. I guess a big boy press conference is what we're calling it. The press conference, the big boy press conference. I think y'all are planning to have.
Gives his press conference, his big boy press conference.
This is the president of the United States. He's supposed to be the most important person in the world, right? And not only have you got all these journalists sort of saying, we're tuning into this press conference because we want to see if this guy can speak without an auto cue. You've got his literal advisors talking about it as if he's kind of a toddler showing he's potty trained. It's really, really bizarre. Of course, if it was a big boy conference, it wasn't one that Biden's littler boys enjoyed. This was a shot of his Secretary of State, Defense Secretary, and National Security Chief as he made his Vice President Trump gaffe.
I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, but I think she was not qualified to be president. So let's start there. Number one.
So 3 people back there was Jake Sullivan, who just goes. And then Tony Blinken, who's the Secretary of State, looked like he was going to cry. Aaron, I mean, as we're going to sort of discuss, Joe Biden still is maintaining that he can stay in the race. I mean, what did you think when you saw those two clips last night?
Well, it's extraordinary, but we had some warnings, Michael. I mean, as far back as 2020, Joe Biden did confuse his sister with his wife. Now, at the time, if you said this, people said you were being outrageous, you were bolstering Trump. But I think it's pretty arguable, I certainly would argue it, that this cognitive decline has been a long time coming. The point is, in 2020, for the most part, he could keep a lid on it. By the way, I don't say this lightly or to bash him or to denigrate him. It's quite sad this is happening in public. I think it's unacceptable and unforgivable, actually, on the part of his family to be pushing him into something he simply should not be doing. But in 2020, for the most part, it was okay. There was, of course, that debate with Bernie Sanders when Bernie had momentum and Biden smashed it. He did a great job. And people like you and I were saying, what was the cocktail of drugs they just gave this guy? It was completely unexpected. But that was the story of 2020. Some bad moments, but for the most part, good, acceptable, sufficient. That's now changed. Now sufficient is like 10 out of 10, big boy, as they're saying. And actually, for him to complete a simple sentence is somehow a superb achievement. You're trying to be the president of the United States. How on earth did we end up in that position? Now, Joe Biden's 81 years old. The point here is, though, Michael, Donald Trump is no spring chicken. He's 78. So this idea, this argument, if you're a young man or young woman up against Trump, that would have a lot more validity. But I think if Trump is going to say he's too old, that simply won't work. The whole point is he's not cognitively fit to be president. And what I find particularly amusing, Michael, is that Kamala Harris, who is the spring chicken, all this, she's 59. We look at Keir Starmer as, in this country, a comparatively old prime minister. He's 61, 62, I believe. He's the oldest person to become prime minister in a really long time. In the United States, there's a very different dynamic going on. The average senator, really old. The average congressperson, a member of Congress rather, really old in terms of the Senate and House of Representatives. The Senate leader, Mitch McConnell, he was really old. Nancy Pelosi, she was really old. You had Dianne Feinstein. She was saying that the Green New Deal people, or New Deal Green, or whatever she called them, didn't know what they were doing. She'd been in this business for decades. She knew what she was doing. She was saying that age 90. There is clearly an issue in the United States of gerontocracy that is not so bad in Europe. In fact, political leaders in Europe have been getting younger. You might think that's a bad thing, but it's just happened. Whereas in the United States, they're getting older. But I think, this is no longer about a narrative battle of ages and, trying to challenge societal expectations about whether or not he's fit to do the job. He is mentally collapsing in real time on television. This is not quote unquote controllable. And now the big problem for the Democrats is you have this battle coming up. Kamala Harris is the most likely candidate, obviously, but a lot of people question whether she's good enough to beat Trump. And of course, if you bypass Harris, people will say, well, she's a woman, she's a person of color. Why have you done that? Those are legitimate questions, by the way. And if that happens at the Democratic convention, there will be, Michael, a civil war amongst Democrats. And of course, the most bankable vote for the Democrats in a presidential race is the African-American vote. If they do bypass Kamala Harris in that way, and there is that battle, my view is it's as good as handing the whole thing to Trump. So they're going to have to go with Harris, regardless of whether or not you think she's a good candidate. To bypass her as VP, given the things I've just said, would create a toxic political fallout, which would put a stake through the heart of the coalition on which the Democrats depend.
Now we're gonna talk a bit more about Kamala Harris in a moment. Of course, though, Joe Biden still hasn't stood aside. That's despite the American public seeming to be quite keen for him to do so. So a full 85% of people tell pollsters he is too old for a second term, and 67% of Americans think he should step aside to let someone else run. Among Democrats, 56% think he should stand aside. But Biden's outriders are still going strong. Sarah Rees-Jones is a political analyst and with over 100,000 followers on X. So she said this: Biden gets a double question on two different topics, remembers each question, keeps them separate, and doubles back to answer. This is not a president in decline. So this is how low the floor is, right? It's like, what makes you qualified to be the president of the United States if you can get asked 2 questions in succession and remember both of them, right? Can you get asked 2 questions in succession, remember them, keep them separately, and then answer them separately? Well, then you could be the most powerful person in the world. America's most prominent liberal talk show host has also been batting for Biden.
I will just say, though, you noted that there were some moments of, startlingly impressive command of the issues. This is just my opinion. He is not only strong on foreign policy, he is just fundamentally right on foreign policy in the way that he talks about it. And again, your mileage may vary. That is how I feel about the way he talks about our relationship with our allies and our relationship with NATO. You can hear his command of the issues, particularly in his asides, like mentioning as an offhand way that it was Turkey really that needed really to be talked into an expansion of NATO that included Finland and Sweden, talking about the numbers of Russian troop losses in Ukraine, talking about the fact that he turned in his notes after he spoke privately with President Xi, alluding to the fact that Trump had all those weird meetings with the Russians and Putin in which he had no note taker present. I mean, it's even in the little asides where it just shows you he is a master of the foreign policy field and has been for decades in his career in the Senate, the vice president, and the presidency.
He is a master of the foreign policy field. Like, I host a YouTube show, right? And I could give you an aside that it was Turkey who were blocking Sweden and Finland from joining NATO, right? That doesn't make you a foreign policy master or a foreign policy expert. That makes you someone who read a couple of articles over the last 2 years, right? That is not difficult to remember. It's the asides. He wasn't even reading that. Off the top of his head, he knew that it was Turkey that was opposed to Sweden and Finland joining NATO. Right? I mean, does he even know why? Does he know why they had that problem? By the way, it's because Sweden was granting asylum to Kurdish activists who were being repressed or oppressed by President Erdogan. But sort of just, that was incredible. Maybe I could be president, right? Maybe I know enough to be president. Those were the outriders. But how does Biden himself explain his fitness for office? Well, he was asked about his cognitive fitness at yesterday's press conference.
I've taken 3 significant and intense neurological exams by a neurologist. In each case, as recently as February. And they say I'm in good shape, okay? Although I do have a little problem with my left foot because it's not as sensitive because I broke my foot and didn't wear the boot. But I'm good. I'm tested every single day about my neurological capacity to do decisions I make every day. You talk to my staff, all of you talk to my staff. Sometimes my staff talks a lot. But the fact of the matter is, I don't think you have them telling you that all the major ideas we've undertaken haven't been in part initiated by me. I remember with the staff, I said, I'm going to go to South Korea. We're going to get the chip. What are you doing? I'm going to get Japan and Korea back together again after essentially having hostilities toward one another since the end of World War II. I'm going to move and see that we can expand it. The only thing age does is help you with it. Creates a little bit of wisdom if you pay attention.
I did that when in Japan, got the chip. What are you doing? Just looking into the distance. What are you doing? Like middle of a sentence. Obviously you shouldn't mock people for being in a state of cognitive decline, right? It's normal, it's honorable. He's also right, that with age comes wisdom, right? I think it's true, and we should absolutely be highlighting this. Yes, we can learn so much from people who are 81, even if they're not as quick on their feet as they once were, right? Okay. Joe Biden, absolutely. I mean, obviously, I disagree with lots of his politics, but sort of in his cognitive state, he absolutely deserves to have sort of a say in public life. Be a really interesting person to get on a podcast to sort of hear his historical insights. But he shouldn't really be president of the United States, and I think that's pretty obvious to everyone who watches that.
Yeah, and Michael, look, they've not had a full cabinet meeting in the US featuring the president for 9 months. You have to suspect that's for a reason, right? It's because he cannot continue with a prolonged conversation with challenging questions being asked of him. The minute he gets off an auto cue now, he literally malfunctions. I mean, I don't like to use that metaphor, but you just saw it there, right? So you can't govern if you're not having a cabinet meeting for as long as 9 months. And like you've said, it's important to say this is not ageism. This is not discriminating against him. Trump is 78. He looks a heck of a lot sharper, but he simply does not seem disposed to being president of the United States. He is unable to complete sentences, and it's a problem. And by the way, this is going to be a problem as societies live longer. We're going to have to think about this. Keir Starmer has proposed that there shouldn't be people in the House of Lords beyond 80. I think you probably will have upper age limits for political representatives, because as people, and look, even if you have stagnating life expectancy like you do in this country, you do have a big chunk of people living longer and longer and longer. And so those Dianne Feinsteins, 90, Nancy Pelosi, 80, being in public office, that's going to become more and more usual. And of course, we had a dress rehearsal with this with Reagan. For much of Reagan's second term in the 80s, I mean, people now overtly admit this, he had dementia. It's going to be a problem. The number one cause of death already, by the way, Michael, in the UK is dementia, because we have people living longer. It's not heart disease, it's not cancer, it's dementia. It's the number one cause of death. Jimmy Carter is still alive, by the way. He lost the 1980 presidency, 80, right? He lost 44 years ago. He's still alive. Bill Clinton, who lost in 2000, he was the president until 24 years ago, he's younger than Biden. So, Biden is extraordinarily advanced in years, and this is a very tough job. And it's not just the job, campaigning for that job. A presidential campaign, Michael, you're in your early 30s, mid 30s. It would take the stuffing out of you. It would knock you for 6. It would do it to anybody. He's 81. He's 81. And the fact his family are putting him through this, I think, is absolutely outrageous. Really. It's going to sully his memory to an extraordinary extent. There's that great quote about Mao. If Mao had died after the Second World War, he would have been, venerated as a legend of Chinese history. If he died in the early 60s, he would have been a hero. He probably died a little bit too late. And again, people might disagree with that, but I think there's something to that. The longer Mao lived, the more it clouded his legacy. So, and I think something's happening with Biden in a similar way, right? If he had just done the one term, stopped Trump in 2020, I think a lot of people would say, "Wow, what a public servant." I don't agree with lots of his politics, for instance, on Israel, but I think that would have been the overall assessment. But now, goodness grief, it's just all being thrown away. And by the way, it's being thrown away so that Donald Trump becomes the president. And I really care about that. I know you do too. I know lots of our audience do. If for no other reason, Michael, then when Donald Trump became president of the United States in 2016, the first thing he did was take the United States out of the Paris Agreement. We need to decarbonize as quickly as possible. Donald Trump doesn't give a toss about that stuff, and that's not to say Biden is perfect on the shift to renewables. And yes, there's been a hell of a lot of fracking under him, and new gas sites have been signed off, etc. But 5x that with Trump in the White House. So this really matters. It has global implications beyond even the foreign policy stuff, beyond the xenophobia stuff. In terms of climate change, it has global implications, and the pride and the narcissism, frankly, I think, of the Biden family, not Joe Biden, but his wife, his son, is actually a variable in how quickly our species addresses climate change and transitions beyond fossil fuels. Crazy, but I think that's actually an accurate summation of where we are.
I would say the narcissism is his as well. Of course, before we move on from this topic, we should talk about the obvious sort of issue here, which is that if Biden does step aside, he'll need a replacement. Many are, of course, assuming that will be his current vice president, Kamala Harris. Harris has herself not been especially popular. She's also prone to some odd flourishes. This is her most famous performance.
You think you just fell out of a coconut tree? You exist in the context of all in which you live and what came before you.
She doesn't talk about coconut trees that often, but she does talk about us living in the context of all that which came before us all the time, actually. There's clips where she sort of says it about in 10 different speeches. So she has, at times been a bit of a subject of mockery, but she does now enjoy polling that's much better than, well, not, I shouldn't say much better, that's slightly better than Biden's. So in a poll this week for the Washington Post, it showed Trump and Biden tied on 46%, but suggested Kamala Harris would beat Trump in the popular vote by 49 to 47%. Aaron, I suppose let's finish this segment on whether, the Democratic establishment will actually get round to toppling Joe Biden. We've heard so many people in leadership positions in the party now sort of say, it's up to him, when he's repeatedly said, I will be the candidate. So you've had sort of Nancy Pelosi sort of say, well, we want Joe Biden to make that decision. She's not saying he should be the candidate. It does seem like lots of people do now want him to stand aside. From my perspective, so much damage has been done to him now that it's kind of impossible for him to stand. It would just be a complete joke. I think the betting markets now suggest that Kamala Harris will replace him. If you were a betting person, who do you think will be the Democratic candidate come November?
If I had to bet, my house on it, I'd probably say Kamala Harris. Although going back, by the way, just to the polling you showed a moment ago, Harris being Trump by 2, that's not good enough. In the popular vote, the Democrat needs to beat the Republican, generally speaking, by 3+ points. Actually, probably more, because of the way the Electoral College breaks down. And all the polling I've seen in the states that matter, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin less so, that neck of the woods, Michigan, the Democrats have big problems. And of course, if Trump takes those seats, he might not, right? But if Trump takes those seats, he is the president. Florida is a write-off. He is the president. So the polling lead you see with Kamala Harris only being 2 better than Trump and Biden being square with Trump. By the way, I don't believe Biden's square with Trump. I don't believe that for 1 second. That's inadequate. That's inadequate. And if it is an even Stevens in terms of the actual voter turnout, as that Biden-Trump polling suggests, it's a landslide win for Trump in the Electoral College. I do agree with you. I think it's getting to a point now where he probably has to. But everybody says the only people he listens to are Jill and actually more so his son, Hunter Biden. And as we know from his biography, Michael, Hunter Biden isn't necessarily the most responsible adult. So let's see. It will be very hard for the Democrats to publicly topple Joe Biden. Very, very hard to do it publicly. If they can do it privately, via Jill Biden, via his son, that's something else. But that might not work. So it's a really tough one, Michael. It's easy to talk in kind of macro analyses like you did there, like it's inevitable. But if he doesn't want to stand down, he's the candidate. That seems to be where we are. And right now, he doesn't want to stand down.
Yeah, the argument for Kamala when it comes to the polling is that if she were made the candidate, then she would be able to sort of, go out in the media and attack Donald Trump more. And then also, if she doesn't have so much support in those sort of Rust Belt states, she can get, a Rust Belt governor to be her vice president or, the candidate. So that would maybe take some of those states. So I think the main argument for Kamala isn't that sort of she's 2 points ahead of Biden, so we must pick her. It's that she's got more of a potential to increase her ratings, whereas Joe Biden doesn't. He's at his limit. She might not yet be at her limit, but neither situation is ideal. The new Labour government inherited a prison system with just 1,400 free places, which is dangerously close to full capacity. And they were forced to make a decision how to stop our prisons overflowing. Well, today they've made their choice. The Justice Secretary today announced that thousands of prisoners will be released in September. Now, these are inmates that have served 40% of their sentences instead of the current 50% required for potential release. The early release scheme will exclude those serving sentences for serious violent crimes and sex offences. This is not exactly a headline Labour will have wanted in their first week in government, but Shabana Mahmood, who is the Justice Secretary, painted the alternative as positively apocalyptic.
The last government left us with a time bomb ticking away. So let me explain what happens if that bomb goes off. Let me explain what happens when prisons run out of space. When prisons are full, violence rises, putting prison officers on the front line at risk. When no cells are available, suspects cannot be held in custody. This means van loads of dangerous people circling the country with nowhere to go. The police would have to use their cells as a prison overflow, keeping officers off the streets. And soon the courts would grind to a halt, unable to hold trials. And the police would have to stop carrying out arrests. With officers unable to act, criminals could do whatever they want without consequence. We could see looters running amok, smashing in windows, robbing shops, and setting neighbourhoods alight. In short, if we fail to act now, we face the collapse of the criminal justice system and a total breakdown of law and order. This is not the plot of some dystopian film. This is the legacy of the last Conservative government. This is the legacy of the guilty men.
I'm not quite sure whether reaching prison capacity would lead to all of our shops being set alight and every, law and order completely breaking down. But Mahmood is, of course, right that this is a crisis of the Tories' making. And it does seem like Labour have little choice other than to go for this early release scheme. Cassia Rowland is a senior researcher specialising in criminal justice at the Institute for Government. I spoke to her earlier today, and I began by asking her whether this move from Mahmood was the right one.
I think so. I think, to be honest, she didn't have that much choice. The state of the crisis in the prison system at the moment is so severe and so acute that there really weren't a lot of options available to her.
That crisis, is it sort of simply just a mathematical problem of there's too many prisoners and not enough spaces? Is that what we can essentially boil it down to?
I think, yes, it comes down to that. Basically, the thing to remember is that there's basically two drivers of the prison population, and that's how many people you're sending to prison and how long they're there. And it's really in the second half of that equation that we've seen big increases in the last sort of 10 to 12 years. And I think that's really at the root of the problem.
What's the reason for that? I mean, why are people getting sent to prison for longer than they used to?
Some of it is explicit changes in sentencing, but more of it, I think, is just not necessarily that judges are responding to any kind of overt political pressure or anything like that, but we just know that there has been this sort of slow sentence inflation over a significant period of time. And I think it's the emphasis on being tough on crime, the rhetoric that we get from the government that makes it quite clear what their priorities are. And there is inevitably going to be some impact that has on decisions that the courts are making, and also on any kind of legislative changes or sentencing guideline changes.
In terms of that, I mean, obviously, this debate about sort of early release, as well as the hiring of James Timpson, has sort of sparked a debate about whether or not people get sent to prison for too long or not long enough. And I suppose on the side of people who are saying they don't get put away for long enough, you hear about sort of cases of someone who's recently been released from prison and then commits sort of an awful crime. So there's the case of Zara Alina, which lots of people will have heard of, a young woman who was murdered by a stranger who'd just been released from prison 9 days earlier in 2022. Just today, actually, I was listening on the radio. So Holly Willoughby, someone had sort of plotted to rape and kill her. And it turns out that he had 2 prior convictions for attempted kidnap, of women. So for people who have a sort of impression that actually it might be the other way around, maybe there are certain people that we're not sending away for long enough because they're able to be released and commit horrendous crimes or plot horrendous crimes. I mean, how would you respond to that?
How long we send people to prison for is absolutely it's a political decision for the government to make. There are a number of different factors that they need to think about when they're doing that. Some of it is about rehabilitation and reducing reoffending. Some of it is about public confidence in the system. It's about public protection. And it's also about deterrence and kind of retribution, punishment. There's all those different things going on. What is really important to remember is that there isn't a lot of evidence that longer prison sentences are more effective either at deterring people or at rehabilitating people. It's a sad inevitability, I think, that there will be very serious offences occasionally committed by people who have recently left prison or have significant previous convictions. That doesn't necessarily mean that the appropriate way to respond to that is sending lots of people to prison for much longer. I think also probably there are some sentences that people might be surprised at how long they can be, particularly relative to other offences. So a lot of drug offences have longer custodial sentences than people might expect relative to some violent offences that might not end up in a custodial sentence at all. So that's probably also part of the picture.
Could you give some examples there? Because I'm never, we always talk about sort of prisoners and the prison population as this big block. And I suppose there's lots of different situations merging into each other. So who goes to prison for drug offences? What kind of drug offences are they? How long do people get put away for?
So it's not your low-level possession of cannabis that is filling up prisons by any means. There are certainly some kind of possession with intent to supply or other supply-related offences that have minimum terms of over 2 years. And that means that they have to go into immediate custody as well. So it can't be a suspended sentence, which means that they serve it in the community unless they commit a further offence. Instead, they have to go into immediate custody. And that also has implications in terms of how people plead and all those kinds of things that affects the rest of the criminal justice system, not just prisons.
Everyone seems to agree that the decision made by Shabana Mahmood, or most people seem to agree that it was necessary as a short-term fix, but it's not a long-term solution. What would the long-term solution be?
The scale of the challenge is such that you probably need to look at both the supply side, increasing capacity in prisons, and the demand side, so how many people you're sending to prison and how long for. As you say, the appointment of James Timson as Prisons and Probation Minister suggests that the sentencing review that Labour have promised in their manifesto is going to be looking at some of those questions around which groups of people are best served with a prison sentence, how long those sentences should be. There's also things you can do in terms of changing conditions in prisons, making them have more of an emphasis on rehabilitation, and in general, improving conditions in prisons can make them more effective. Often we hear about basically people not wanting luxuries for prisoners and the sense that people get more in prison than they might do if they'd never committed a crime in the first place. That can lead to, some negative approaches to what you need to actually make prisons effective. People talk a lot about how they're essentially just warehouses full of people. You're not providing them with opportunities. Educational opportunities are very limited, but also all kinds of purposeful activities like just work and things like that are quite limited. So there's definitely things you could do around that, which would hopefully longer term reduce your prison population by helping lower reoffending rates and the rate at which people come back into the system. And then there is basically the capacity expansion option, where Labour committed during the election campaign to delivering the remaining sort of 14,000 odd prison places of the 20,000 initially promised in 2021. And I think even if long term they're hoping to cut the prison population, it still makes sense to do a lot of that work, because some of the prison spaces that we have at the moment are in such terrible condition that even if you did manage to start driving the population down, you'd want to do something about taking those out of service so that you can have a more humane and habitable prison system.
In terms of the terrible conditions, so I've been sort of following this policy debate this week with sort of great interest. It seems like there's a lot of disagreement about how long people should go to jail for and what's the real purpose of it. You know, people on the right tend to talk about incapacitation. So you're sort of taking people off the streets. You might not be reforming them. Longer sentences might not deter people, but there are some people you just want to remove from society. That's sort of the focus they have. And then you've got people more like on the James Timpson end where they're sort of saying we need to focus on rehabilitation. There's no point in warehousing people. What everyone seems to agree on is that prisons themselves are terrible places. And if there were a chance of rehabilitation, the prisons are not doing that job because they're just warehousing people. And I suppose my question is why is that? You sort of mentioned sort of, I suppose, you know, popular opinion. So the public don't want this idea that sort of prisoners will have a reasonable quality of life because they want it to be miserable because it's supposed to be punishment. But then there's also just cost cutting. I mean, is the dire state of prisons, is it because of a sort of ideology of punishment, or is it simply because the Tories wanted to cut the budget by 25% and sort of a collapse of the quality of prisons was just an inevitable consequence of that?
I think it is easier to make cuts to a lot of criminal justice services than some of the other public services because they're more remote from people's lives, and most people don't have any contact with the prison system. They don't have any contact with people who do have any contact with the prison system. So I guess there's a convenient alignment between the interests of cost cutting and reducing staff members, expenditure on prisons, all of that sort of thing. And it's not as politically unpalatable as making equivalent cuts to local government services or schools or any of those other public services.
Obviously, it does seem like Tory incompetence that got us here. Do you think this is going to be a sort of continuing problem for the Labour government, or do you think this is sort of teething and now we've got the adults back in charge? They'll make all of this work a bit more smoothly?
I certainly hope that things will be smoother than they have been. It is a really profound policy failure that we've seen, particularly in the last 2 years, but also over the last almost 10 years, I would say. So at least since 2015, it's been very clear where we were heading, that we were going to run out of capacity if the population grew as it was projected to do. And I think it's hard to overstate how serious that is as a failing on the part of the government. Whether it's going to get better, I think we have to wait and see. There have been some really positive signs. I think it's great that the decision was made to lower the point of automatic release to 40% rather than going for 43 or 45, which were some of the other numbers that were discussed, because hopefully that will give them a bit more breathing room to make some sensible long-term decisions. I also think it's really positive that Shabana Mahmood talked about recruiting new trainee probation officers, and the probation service is also in really dire straits, so that should help. And having this 10-year capacity strategy that they're planning to set out at the autumn statement, there's a lot of signs of more longer term thinking and joined up thinking that are really welcome. But I think we will have to see whether they can kind of stay the course in the face of what's likely to be quite sustained political pressure on this.
That was Cassia Rowland from the Institute for Government speaking to me earlier today. Labour might have won a landslide last week, but they weren't the only party to have had a good night. The Greens quadrupled their number of MPs. Reform went from 1 MP to 5. And after coming first in 71 constituencies, the Liberal Democrats had their best ever election night. So what was the secret to the success of the Lib Dems? Well, according to The Economist, it was this: the upmarket bakery, Gails. The Economist writes this: Lib Dem strategists invented a rule of thumb. Any town outside London with a branch of Gails, a bourgeois bakery chain, had activists hurled at it. It worked. The result was a vote of extreme efficiency, concentrated in Britain's lovelier parts. The idea that the Liberal Democrats won over Britain's lovelier parts and richest voters is not just evidenced by the proximity of Lib Dem MPs to posh pastries, but also hard statistics. So The Economist also wrote this. The Liberal Democrats control 5 of the 10 most prosperous constituencies in Britain. Almost half of all Lib Dem seats, so 33, are in the top decile. Among the 325 least prosperous constituencies, it has just 7 MPs. Aaron, it was a really interesting piece in The Economist, I think by Duncan Robinson, so their Badjo editor. Was it Badger? I'm never sure how you pronounce it.
Baycott, anyway.
Baycott, and so I got it wrong sort of in both ways. Third time lucky. But the argument being made wasn't just that sort of Lib Dems appeal to rich people, which I think won't be much of a surprise sort of to many of our audience, but he's also making a broader point about sort of British politics, which is for a long time, it's been focused on, what's called left behind voters in the red wall, people who, are from potentially, regions that sort of economic growth hasn't touched in the same way that it has in those seats in the southeast. And Duncan Robinson is arguing that actually a really important group of voters now are people who are well off, who are switching between the Tories and the Lib Dems, evidenced by the number of Lib Dem MPs who have won in constituencies that contain a Gails bakery. What do you make of it? What did you make of the argument?
Yeah, I found this fascinating, Michael. And of course, the Gails thing is quite amusing. That's the shorthand. But it basically means, affluent towns, hamlets, villages across what was previously called the Blue Wall. And the Lib Dems have absolutely nailed it. Not just the commuter belt around Surrey and Sussex, all the way through to Devon and Cornwall, the A30, which was a historic heartland of theirs until 2015. They have just absolutely smashed it. The only target seat they missed out on was the place I went to, Godalming, the seat of Jeremy Hunt. Technically, Godalming and Ash. There is a Gails there. I've been. It's very nice. Also, there are some places with Gails they didn't win. I think Petersfield, I don't think they won that. They have a lovely Gails there, Michael. But in all seriousness, it was something I remarked on with these videos I did while out and about during the election campaign. I went to Godalming, I went to Chichester, I've been to Winchester, not a Novara business, but just happened to do a walkabout Hastings. And what was very obvious to me was that if you go to somewhere like a Waitrose, everybody under 65 hates the Tories. Nobody likes the Tories. 14 years ago, these people were voting Conservative, certainly 10 years ago, certainly in 2015. That was the bedrock of the majority that they won. And remember, since 1992, of course, the Tories won a majority in 1992, they've only won 2 majorities. One was 2019, to a large part because of Brexit, and the other one was 2015. And you need those people. Without Brexit, you need those people to form a majority. And what's particularly striking for me, Michael, is that over the last 4 years, really, the Tory party has declared war on a large part of their base. They didn't just neglect them, a bit like you could argue Labour did with the Red Wall over a decade and a half, 2 decades. They didn't just neglect them, like Mandelson says, where else can they go? They declared war on them. Middle-class, affluent Southerners basically were viewed as, idiots by a big part of the Tory party. And now they've paid the price. And I think that's interesting. And by the way, they didn't just break to the Lib Dems. You can go a bit further north, somewhere like North Herefordshire. Obviously went to the Greens, Waveney Valley. Labour picked up places like Bournemouth for the first time, Poole. They picked up Hastings. So this base of the Tory party, the sort of affluent, centre-right, centrist middle class, is kind of evaporating for them. And that's a big problem. And now look, they're going to probably have Suella Braverman as their next leader or Kemi Badenoch. I don't think these guys are particularly interested in getting them back. So it's an interesting moment, the rot in terms of that part of their vote. Maybe they've got further to fall. And then finally, what I would say, Michael, is to pull this all back into a sort of conversation which a left-wing audience or a progressive audience, a socialist audience, which is the case, of course, for many people watching and listening to Novara Live, pulling this back into the things they care about. These voters, Tory, Lib Dem, swing voters in these quite pleasant places, I think are angry because they want an effective, pleasant public realm, and that's gone. What do I mean by that? Well, water is a good example. Coastal waters with shit and effluent in them. Rivers. The high street, they want a high street that looks pleasant and isn't dirty. They want an NHS that works. They want ambulances to come relatively quickly. You got to get GP appointments. So That doesn't mean they're socialists or they're radicals or, they're communistas or they want public ownership, but they do want a public realm which works. And frankly, the Conservative Party since 2010 doesn't even believe in the idea of a public realm. I'd also extend that, by the way, to law and order. They think the police have disappeared. So they believe in a public realm, which from the perspective of Labour makes them a really alluring target. And until the Conservative Party realise that, I think they're in big trouble. These are people that say, we want a public realm, we want things that we all depend on in the public to work. And the Tories were saying, would you like a tax cut with your national insurance contributions? They are on a completely different planet on this stuff. So I think that is a big problem again for the Conservative Party. And finally, on the clean water thing, Michael, in Chichester, it was just exemplary of all of this. I would speak to people who are lifelong Tory voters. They sail, they have beach huts, or they walk their dog around Chichester Harbour, and they said, I can't vote for a party which allows this to happen. It was exactly the same in North Herefordshire with regards to the River Wye. And what was the response from Conservative activists? Oh, this is all made up, it's a fake story. People are only talking about this now because we've started to measure it. It's not actually new. Well, go tell that to the dog walker who's voted Tory for the last 50 years but can't do it anymore because when they walk their golden retriever, there's shit coming up on the coast, and they won't let the dog in the sea because they might get E. coli, right? Or when you have the boat race, actually, you've got people saying to the rowers by Putney Bridge and whatnot, don't dive out of the boat because you might get sick. This is a very real thing in the popular consciousness. So it's a really fascinating moment. But I would also say for people on the left, there's something there. There's a foothold to try and reach out to these people, these wavering Lib Dem Tories. They believe in a public realm, and I think that's really, really important.
Israel has ordered residents of Gaza City to leave the city again. Those still living there are now forced to decide where to move next, most having been displaced multiple times already. Channel 4 News have released a powerful report on the latest from Gaza's capital.
Gaza City early this morning. Paramedics race through rubble-strewn streets. They're on their way to the site of yet another Israeli strike. The bombing now is the most intense it's been since the early days of the war. Injured people are loaded into ambulances, but there are no longer any major hospitals still operating in the city to treat them. In a small clinic, a tiny survivor pulled from the debris. Baby Omar, just 3 weeks old. His mother, father, and older sister, all dead. Frail and alone, a distraught aunt wonders how to care for him.
I just heard my family's home was bombed. They told us everyone is under the rubble. We could hear the baby crying, and they took him out. I don't know what to say. What is this baby's fault?
Outside, on the blood-stained floor, the remains of what was once a loving family.
A really, really powerful report from Channel 4. I mean, we were seeing lots more reports like this sort of at the start of the war. I think many people sort of worried that sort of as time has passed, situations like this where you have a baby pulled out of rubble whose entire family have been killed by an Israeli airstrike. These are still happening. We're hearing less about them, right? I think it's really, really important that Channel 4 News are still there on the ground making reports such as these. And let's watch some more of it.
Israeli soldiers are on the ground once again in Gaza City, battling, they say, Hamas fighters. But there's a constant stream of civilian casualties and nowhere near enough resources to treat them.
This used to be a small local clinic to treat simple diseases. Now it's an emergency room and we're working 24/7 because the bombing doesn't stop.
This had been the last remaining functioning hospital in Gaza City. The beds in its chapel, now empty. All staff and patients evacuated. Many residents are fleeing. Today, the Israeli army dropped leaflets warning the entire city would be treated as a dangerous combat zone, highlighting what it said was safe routes to the south. But this is a population that's exhausted and terrified.
We don't know where to go. I'm just going around and around in circles. There's nowhere to go. There's bombing everywhere. Listen, see, you can hear that.
Practically all of Gaza's more than 2 million inhabitants have been displaced, time and time again. Some direct their anger and frustration at Hamas as well as Israel.
We've had to move 20 times from one neighborhood to another. What did we do? This is not our fault. Where are the Hamas leaders, sitting on their chairs, comfortably? Haven't they thought about our suffering? Our children have been martyred, our homes have been destroyed.
It's really interesting, that sort of final interview that Channel 4 showed, where you've got someone really annoyed at Hamas. I mean, I think obviously, I think the ultimate cause of what's going on is the fact that Israel wouldn't accept its borders and wanted to make a greater Israel, right? I think that's the ultimate cause. I can also see why Palestinian civilians might think that Hamas are sort of, I think actually that you get this with lots of activists as well, as sort of seeing the national struggle as more important than people's individual lives, but that's more contentious. Ultimately, Aaron, I think here what you're seeing is, Israel's aim, which was to completely destroy Hamas, means that this war could go on, almost forever, right? They said we were clearing Gaza City of Hamas. Then they say, we've done it. Some people move back. Obviously, you can't completely destroy a movement which is really quite strong, which is really ingrained in Gaza. It's been in power for over a decade. And so then you'll get some more fighting. Israel will say, well, now we're being shot at. We need to send in more airstrikes. And this could just go on forever, right? They say, go to the south where it's safe. Then ultimately there'll be, Hamas will appear there again because they're a resistance movement. Israel will have airstrikes at them. So this idea that you can bomb a resistance movement out of existence does mean that this war could just go on forever with, Palestinian civilians bearing the brunt of it.
Well, Benjamin Netanyahu wants this war to go for as long as possible, because the minute it's over, he will no longer be the Prime Minister of Israel. Essentially, Michael, it's in his political interest to carry this on indefinitely. That opening video, by the way, of the child, which didn't have effectively a family anymore, it's just extraordinary. And the thing is, our government allows arms sales, our new government as well, allows arms sales to people doing this. This is a genocide. And I think this is a very classic example of ethnic cleansing. And the difference between what's happening now and what was happening before is that rather than viewing this greater Israel as being a project which takes a century, you're now seeing people around the Israeli state actually thinking, we can probably do this in a couple of years. And it's not just in Gaza, it's in the West Bank too. You had the G7 condemn the state of Israel for saying that I think about 1,200 hectares in the West Bank are now state lands of Israel. They signed off thousands of new units being built in illegally developed settlements in the West Bank. That's the government of Israel is signing that off. And the G7, Michael, they condemned it. What on earth? The United States is saying, you can have F-35s, you can have, 14, 15, 16, $17 billion of aid, but we're going to condemn you, right? We're going to spend $300 million plus on this pier. What? You don't need a pier, just go through Rafah. You can't, because the IDF are bombing every convoy that's using a land route. Just say that. You spend $300 million plus on this pier, which, by the way, it didn't last a month. Why? So you can have a talking point in a State of the Union address. And by the way, the idea of a pier, Michael, didn't come from the White House or even some think tank in Washington. It came from Israel Katz, the Israeli foreign minister. So it was an Israeli idea which cost the US taxpayer $300 million. And it lasted not even a month. So we're just in a surreal moment of geopolitics. And it's almost like you have the US, you have the European nations too, and of course they're calling for a ceasefire. We are seeing a genocide. I don't understand what's so hard to comprehend here. There are very powerful factions in Israeli civil society and the Israeli military. Actually, more frankly, within politics. I think the politics of the IDF is not quite the median IDF commander is not as crazy as Smotrich and Ben Gvir and people settling in the West Bank. They're still pretty crazy, but not that crazy. But those people who are the tail wagging the dog in terms of the Israeli government, Smotrich and Ben Gvir, now envisage a greater Israel, which doesn't take a century, which takes 5 to 10 years, 15 years. They want those people out. They want them out. And I know mainstream Israeli people who work in certain institutions who have no problem with settlers in the West Bank destroying aid. Settlers in the West Bank destroying aid that was coming en route to go to Gaza, which we all saw, by the way. They have no problem with that. They have zero problems with that. These are people who work in think tanks, NGOs, diplomatic offices. I know of this. Okay, they have zero problems with that. I think to any sensible person, even if you support Israel, you'd say that's a bit too much. And I saw yesterday, Michael, I know we can't show it here. I saw yesterday another image of a child without a head. Can you imagine being the parent of a child who that happens to? If that happened to me, if my daughter, she's 8 months old now, if that happened to her, I would say, well, I have to avenge the people that did this until my dying breath. My life isn't worth anything anymore. My life is only worth something in so much as I can kill the people that did this. That's what I would think. You can think I'm wrong, whatever. I'm a Christian, by the way. I'm meant to believe in forgiveness. If it was my child, I would do that. Sorry. That means I'm damned, so be it. And by the way, all of the people saying that Palestinians are all Hamas, Israel is doing nothing wrong, if that happened to their children, they would be exactly the same. That lady who was saying, Hamas is responsible or partly responsible, we know from data that is not a representative response. That is not a normal response. Most people, there is, whether or not you agree with it, there is still a significant amount of support for Hamas as a resistance movement within the Palestinian population. Now, of course, some people in the right points that go, see? Well, equally, if you've just seen your child beheaded and there are people fighting back against the people that are doing it, of course you're going to support them. Of course you are. If that happened to me, I would join the resistance movement. Of course you would. Can we stop pretending otherwise, by the way? Can we stop pretending otherwise? The talking heads that go on, BBC Question Time and talk like this, or Douglas Murray and The Sun. If that happened to your child, you would be the same. Of course you would. Of course you would. But we have to pretend this is obviously just a fantasy. These images, Michael, by the way, are the biggest existential threat to the state of Israel. It's not activists. It's not this or that group or this or that person. These images will eradicate any sympathy for the state of Israel among Western publics. By the way, Israel depends on the West. It will eradicate any sympathy amongst Western publics, particularly the young. And that is, of course, the future of these societies in 10, 20, 30 years, probably for the rest of my life. And there will be consequences from these images being dispersed in the way they have for a very, very long time. Probably for longer than you or I will be here, Michael. So this is epochal. We're seeing a genocidal war. We're seeing an attempt at extermination. If you want to prevaricate and pretend otherwise, go ahead. This hasn't stopped. This is carrying on. But like I say, counterintuitively, these images are potentially a stake through the heart of the long-term future of the state of Israel, because they cannot depend on the US supporting them indefinitely when you see significant numbers of young Americans. By the way, the future of the US establishment, people at Columbia University, Harvard, Stanford, the future of the US establishment saying that the way you carry on is unacceptable, and we absolutely repudiate the ability of any state to exist like this, which is a permanent state of de facto war. And finally, the siege on Gaza, Michael, is by nature of what is happening a war crime en masse. It is probably the longest continuing war crime I can think of, in so much as this is a siege against an entirely civilian population. That's clearly what is happening. This is an act of mass collective terror being imposed on a civilian population in the millions. Okay? And a siege historically is an act of war. You would undertake a siege against a military encampment, a castle in the Middle Ages, for instance, or the siege of Stalingrad, when you had two opposing conventional armies, the USSR and the Third Reich. This is nothing of the sort. And I think it's time, Michael, that the Labour Party says that. This is, we can talk about stop selling weapons. Starmer is saying, I want to recognize the state of Palestine. The way that the IDF is carrying on, there will not be Palestinians in this land for you to recognize a state. We need to stop the arms sales. And I frankly think that we need to the West needs to sever relations with Israel as long as this carries on. It's an atrocity that's not already happened.
I was just looking up support for Hamas sort of in response to your representative sample. You are right. So this is from the BBC from last month. A regular poll carried out by a West Bank-based think tank, the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, claims that most people in Gaza still blame Israel and its allies for the war rather than Hamas. They say the latest survey in June said that almost 2/3 of Gazan respondents were satisfied with Hamas, a rise of 12 points from December, and suggested that just around half would still prefer Hamas to run Gaza after the war ends over any other option. Obviously, it's very difficult to poll people in a war zone, but that's the best evidence and information we have, and that should be taken very, very seriously. It's long been clear the UK is complicit in the genocidal war being inflicted on Gaza by Israel. We trade with Israel, we sell them weapons, and we give them diplomatic cover. But a new report by Declassified shows just how far this complicity goes. So the outlet has revealed that throughout the war, the United States has been flying special forces planes to Israel via a UK base in Cyprus. They've actually been reporting on this for a while. They've got a bit more detail sort of about precisely which type of planes have been taking off from Cyprus and heading to Gaza. The UK always says we don't comment on the actions of our allies, but it does seem pretty clear that sort of support is going to Israel, and support for their military campaign is going to Israel via a UK military base. Aaron, I mean, I suppose, this isn't a surprise, right? The Americans are an ally of the UK. The UK is supporting, whatever they like to say, that the UK is supporting this war on the Palestinians in Gaza. Does this sort of direct involvement change anything for you?
100%. I was speaking to Jeremy Corbyn earlier today for an interview that we're publishing on Sunday, and he had two very simple demands, and he didn't overtly say they're his demands, but they're two things that need to end, which is we need to stop the sale of arms, but also technology related to military applications like engines. We need to stop the sale of those to Israel, and we need to stop the use of these airfields and air bases for anything related right now to the ongoing war in Gaza. Those are two things I think which we can demand of the government. And my goodness, Michael, I think any sensible, rational person would agree.
I agree with you there. And let's hope that the Labour Party come under sufficient scrutiny for that now they are in government. I mean, they're really getting a honeymoon from the mainstream press, so it doesn't seem like they will be. But you did have those independent candidates who put some pressure on them. Aaron, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
My pleasure, Michael. And that point about the independence is so true. The election of Jeremy Corbyn, which a bunch of people work their butt off for, that is going to matter so much. Not just now, but also if Trump's re-elected in November, because of course the default of the UK is just to follow the US. So I know often people think, what's the point? Why bother? Activism's a waste of time. Those of you who got those independents elected, who got Jeremy Corbyn elected, it's going to have a massive impact on UK foreign policy for the next 4 or 5 years.
Let's hope so. Thank you everyone for watching this evening. We'll see you back here on Monday at 6 p.m. For now, good night.